I never imagined betrayal would come dressed in my son's voice, calm, practiced, almost bored, as he stood in my own living room and told me that my house, the place I'd spent nearly 4 decades building a life inside, no longer belonged to me. For 37 years, this old 2-story colonial on Maple Street had been the anchor of my life. Tom and I bought it when we were still young enough to believe every problem had a simple solution, when money was tight but hope was abundant. Inside these walls, I learned how to be a wife, then a mother, then a widow. I could close my eyes and hear echoes of Brian's childhood, his laughter on the stairs, his pounding footsteps toward the kitchen whenever he smelled cookies, his awkward teenage complaints about curfews and chores. After Tom died 5 years ago, the house didn't feel empty, it felt loyal. It held me together when grief tried to unravel the edges of my days. People suggested downsizing, starting over, finding a place more suitable for a woman my age. But they didn't understand. I wasn't living in a house. I was living inside a museum of my marriage, of motherhood, of everything that had shaped me. Brian used to understand that too. Or at least, I thought he did. For most of his adult life, we had a cordial rhythm. Sunday dinners every month, obligatory birthday calls, the occasional request to babysit their dog. He lived 40 minutes away in a modern townhouse with Tiffany, whose perfectly highlighted hair and camera-ready smile made her look more like a real estate billboard than a daughter-in-law. But 6 months ago, something shifted. It didn't happen all at once. It began subtly, like the low hum of a refrigerator you don't notice until it stops. "Mom," Brian said one Sunday, eyeing the staircase like it was a lawsuit waiting to happen, "have you ever thought about downsizing? I mean, this house must be a lot for you." I laughed, brushing it off. "I'm not hauling lumber up and down the stairs, sweetheart. I'm fine." He didn't push, not that day. But the seed had been planted. Then came the unannounced visits. Tiffany strolling through my home with the same expression she probably used at property showings, sharp, appraising, silently calculating value. "This kitchen is very retro," she said once, running her manicured fingers along the countertop. "Imagine what an open concept could do. Buyers love light, space, modern lines." I wasn't a buyer, and I wasn't selling. Her comments became a weekly soundtrack to her visits. "These windows leak so much heat. That boiler must cost a fortune. I worry about you all alone in a house this big." Always spoken with a tone that hovered somewhere between concern and condescension. I was 68, not 98. I still gardened, volunteered at the library, and drove myself wherever I pleased. But they spoke to me like I was one misplaced step away from needing round-the-clock supervision. Then came the phone calls, late-night ones that always began with fake concern and ended with unsettling questions. "Have you updated your will, Mom? Do you have a healthcare proxy? Would you consider a reverse mortgage?" I could help with the paperwork. It felt less like he was checking on me, and more like he was checking what I was worth. And then came that Tuesday in October, the day the air felt strange and sharp, like the world was about to tilt. I was in my garden, trimming the last of the autumn roses, when I heard a car door slam. Brian's silver sedan. Alone. No Tiffany. That alone was unusual enough to put my nerves on edge. "Mom," he said stiffly, "we need to talk." He brushed past me without waiting for an invitation. That was when I knew whatever he came to say, it wasn't going to be good. Inside the living room, he stood exactly where Tom used to sit to lace his boots. The contrast was almost painful. "Brian, what's going on?" I asked. He inhaled deeply, like he was about to deliver a professional presentation, not speak to the woman who raised him. "I sold your house," he said, flat, final, as if reading a weather report. "I used the money to pay for a vacation for Tiffany and me. We're going to the Maldives for our 10th anniversary." I blinked. The words didn't register at first, like my brain refused to process them. "You sold my house? You have 1 day to pack your things," he continued, avoiding my eyes. "The sale closes tomorrow. The new owners want to move in this weekend." The room spun. My knees buckled, and I had to grip the arm of Tom's old chair just to stay upright. "And where exactly am I supposed to go?" I whispered. He pulled a glossy pamphlet from his coat pocket. "We found you a nice assisted living facility. Sunset Gardens. You'll be happier there, and safer." There it was again, that word. As if my independence were a medical risk. As if my home were a hazard. As if I were an inconvenience. I looked at my son, My boy, who used to bring me dandelions and call them bouquets, and saw a stranger wearing his face. He didn't see me as a mother anymore. He saw me as a property title that needed transferring. But here's what he didn't know. The house wasn't in my name. Tom and I, following our attorney's advice, had placed it in a living trust years earlier. I wasn't the owner, I was the trustee. Brian had no legal authority to sell anything without my signature. He thought he'd cornered me, but he'd only walked himself into a trap, so I smiled a small, almost amused smile I didn't feel. Brian mistook it for surrender. When he left, driving off with the satisfaction of someone who believes he just solved a problem, I sat in silence for 20 minutes. I let myself feel the sting, the humiliation, the heartbreak. Then I stood up, wiped my eyes, opened my laptop, and confirmed everything through the county clerk's office. The house was legally untouchable. Brian had either forged something or he'd lied as a power play. Either way, it was a crime, and I wasn't going to be his victim. I went to the phone and dialed a number I'd prayed I'd never need. "Sarah?" I said when she answered. "I need your help. My son just tried to steal my home." Sarah arrived the next morning at precisely 9 a.m., her heels clicking on my porch with the confidence of someone who had spent decades walking into rooms where people underestimated her. She was Tom's old law school friend, the woman he used to call the only person who can intimidate a judge without saying a word. Seeing her standing in my doorway felt like watching a storm roll in, powerful, unstoppable. Exactly what I needed. "Tell me everything," she said, settling into the same armchair where Brian had stood and declared my life over. So I did. I told her about the questions Brian had been asking for months, the surprise visits, Tiffany's critiques, the late-night calls that pretended to be concern, and finally, the bombshell. "I sold your house. You have 1 day to pack." Sarah didn't gasp. She didn't look shocked. Her jaw simply tightened the way a soldier might grip a shield. "Do you have any written documentation?" she asked. "No." He said everything to my face. "Then, we build it," she said, piece by piece. While she opened her laptop, I could feel the steadiness returning to my body, like her presence alone reminded my bones what strength felt like. It took her less than 5 minutes to confirm what I had learned the night before. "The trust gives you full control, Margaret. He can't sell anything without your consent." A pause. "And if he told movers, buyers, or agents that he had consent, then he committed fraud." The words sat in the air like smoke. Fraud. My son. My own flesh and blood. But it was no longer just about the house. Something inside me needed to understand why he'd done this, why a man with a good job and a polished life would stoop so low. While Sarah made her list of actions, file APS paperwork, document all contact, gather financial records, record any visits, I grabbed my phone and dialed a number I'd never called before. Brian's colleague, Robert Chen, a kind man I'd met at 2 company holiday parties. He answered cheerfully at first, but when I asked if Brian had been acting strange, his tone changed. There was a long, heavy silence before he said quietly, "Mrs. Sanderson, I probably shouldn't say this, but Brian took out a large personal loan last month. 6 figures. He said it was for an investment, but people are talking. Something's wrong." My heart sank. "What do you mean something's wrong?" "He's been distracted. Missing deadlines. His biggest client is threatening to leave." I thanked him and hung up, feeling as if someone had poured ice water down my spine. Debt, desperation, a son drowning quietly while pretending to be a man in control. But why lie? Why not just come to me? A thought struck me, sharp and unwelcome. Tiffany. I opened my laptop and pulled up her Facebook page. She thought I didn't know how social media worked. She thought wrong. Scrolling through 6 months of posts was like peeling back a layer of paint only to find rot underneath. Maldives countdown, 82 days. Manifesting abundance, Maldives 2024. Pictures of white sand beaches, overwater villas, champagne glasses held at perfect angles for likes. They had built their image around this trip. They had bragged about it, promised it, displayed it like a trophy they hadn't earned. They needed that vacation. Needed it more than they needed me. And they decided my home was the perfect way to pay for it. That realization didn't hurt, it hardened me. I was still thinking about it when a large white moving van pulled up outside my house at 2:45 p.m. My stomach dropped. Sarah stood next to me, phone already open, recording. "Let them knock," she whispered. When the knock came, 3 sharp raps that made my heart jump, Sarah stepped forward and opened the door. 2 men in matching shirts and heavy work boots stood on the porch. "Afternoon, ma'am," the older one said. "We're from Reliable Movers. Your son hired us to help you pack." Sarah's voice became steel. "Gentlemen, I need to see the work order." They exchanged confused looks, but handed it over. Sarah scanned it and then folded it neatly. "This order was placed under false pretenses," she said. "Mrs. Sanderson has not agreed to any move. She is the trustee of this property, and her son has no legal authority here. If you proceed, you will be participating in attempted fraud." The men paled visibly. Sorry, ma'am. We'll call Mr. Sanderson." "Yes," Sarah said. "You should." They left, muttering angrily as they climbed back into their truck. But before I could even exhale, Brian's silver sedan pulled into the driveway, faster than usual, as if he'd been racing home from wherever he'd gotten the call. Tiffany sat in the passenger seat, her jaw tight, her sunglasses hiding nothing. Brian slammed the door and marched toward us. "What the hell is going on?" Sarah matched his energy without lifting her voice. "Mr. Sanderson, I am Sarah Morrison, your mother's attorney. Any attempt to remove her property, intimidate her, or claim ownership of this house without her written consent is illegal." Brian's face drained of color. "Mom, what is this? Why are you doing this?" I stepped onto the porch, feeling stronger than I had in months. "You tried to sell my house, Brian. You tried to evict me." "I was helping you," he shouted, louder than the situation required. "You can't live here alone anymore. You're not thinking clearly. Tiffany and I found a solution." "A solution that includes a $47,000 Maldives package?" I said quietly. His eyes widened. Tiffany flinched. "You think I don't know? You think I can't use a computer? I know about the debt, the loan, the missed deadlines, and now you want to use my home to patch the holes in your life." Tiffany stepped forward, voice dripping with insult. "Margaret, if you weren't so stubborn, none of this would have been necessary." Sarah cut in. "Necessary? Are you confessing to coercive financial manipulation?" Tiffany's mouth snapped shut. Brian's shoulders sagged with something between panic and shame. "Mom, please. We need the money. We were desperate. And I'm your mother," I said softly. "Not your bank. And not your victim." For the first time, he seemed to understand that his plan was collapsing, that I wasn't the frail woman he thought he could push aside. Sarah leaned closer to me. "We have everything we need. Evidence, motive, witnesses." And in that moment, I felt something inside me settle into place, steady, immovable, unbreakable. The fight had officially begun. The day after Brian's meltdown in my driveway, my house felt strangely still, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Sarah stayed the night, insisting, actually, because she didn't trust Brian not to show up again with another stunt. I didn't argue. Having someone in the guest room made the silence feel less sharp. By morning, Sarah had turned my dining room into a legal command center. Papers spread across the table like a battlefield map, bank statements, credit card records, the moving company's work order, screenshots of social media posts Tiffany never expected me to see. "This," Sarah said, tapping a statement, "is enough motive to fuel an entire case. Debt. So much debt I felt dizzy looking at the numbers. Designer clothes, car leases priced like mortgages, meals at restaurants where the bill could have paid for my groceries for a month. And then the biggest slap, my eyes landed on a line item that made my skin prickle. Tropical Dreams Luxury Resorts, Maldives package, $47,000. A vacation they'd already paid for. A vacation they planned to fund by stripping me of the home I'd lived in longer than they'd been alive. I pressed a hand to my chest, not in pain but in disbelief. They already spent money they didn't have. They expected to refill the tank using your house, Sarah said gently. They weren't planning for your future, Margaret. They were planning for theirs. It was one thing to suspect it, another to see the proof in black and white. 3 days later, financial statements continued to arrive, some from banks, some from old accounts I had forgotten existed, but Brian never removed me from his co-signer. The more we uncovered, the clearer the picture became. They weren't drowning, they were holding onto the anchor and pulling themselves deeper. I was photographing a credit card statement when the doorbell rang. I froze. Sarah looked up from her laptop. Expecting anyone? No. She stood, instinctively putting herself between me and the door. But when she peeked through the window, she relaxed. Flowers. A massive bouquet of roses, my favorite. Delivered by a teenager who looked relieved when I opened the door. For Margaret, he said, handing them over. The card was simple. Mom, I'm sorry. Please call me. Love, Brian. I placed them in water because they were beautiful, not because the apology meant anything. The emotional manipulation had begun. That afternoon, the emails started. First Tiffany, a long, rambling message dripping with guilt, painted in soft, trembling words, as if she were the victim. Dear Margaret, I can't sleep. I can't stop crying. This family is falling apart. We only wanted to help you. We're terrified. Something bad will happen to you, alone in that house. Brian is heartbroken. We miss you. Can't we meet? Just the three of us? No lawyers, just family. Love, Tiffany. I let out a humorless laugh as I passed the phone to Sarah. She almost had me for 3 seconds, I admitted. That's the point, Sarah said. Guilt is the oldest trick in the book. I forwarded it to her official email for documentation, then typed a short, clean response. Tiffany, I am open to reconciliation after legal matters are resolved and genuine apologies are made. Margaret. Her reply came minutes later. Legal matters? You're treating us like criminals. This is what your lawyer is doing, turning you against us. We were only trying to help. I didn't respond. Over the next few days, the contact escalated. Brian left voicemails alternating between devastated son and furious child. Mom, please. I made a mistake. Why are you doing this? You're breaking my heart. If you loved me, you would talk to me. You're letting strangers come between us. The worst one came late at night, his voice tight with resentment. You're being manipulated, Mom. That lawyer is using you. We are your real family. I saved every message, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't get to me. The silence in the house grew heavier, pressing into my chest like a weight. Even when I knew the truth, even when I knew he was wrong, he was still my son. The boy I once sang to sleep. The teenager who hugged me from behind while I cooked. The man who kissed my cheek at his wedding. Losing him felt like grieving a living person. But then salvation arrived in the form of my Thursday book club. We were midway through discussing a mystery novel when Helen peered at me over her glasses and said, Margaret, you're folding your bookmark into tiny squares. What's going on? And something in me cracked. I told them. Everything. The fraud, the movers, the lies, the roses, the guilt, the loneliness. Silence followed, but it wasn't judgmental. It was heavy, sympathetic, angry on my behalf. Oh, honey, Clara said, reaching for my hand. My nephew did something similar to his mother-in-law last year. You're doing exactly what you should be doing. Patricia nodded fiercely. These tactics, guilt, fear, threats, love bombing, they're straight out of abuse playbooks. You're not alone, Helen added firmly. Whatever you need, we're here. For the first time in weeks, the knot in my chest loosened, and it didn't stop there. Over the next week, Helen stopped by twice with homemade soup and warm company. Clara, whose husband was a retired police officer, helped me adjust home security. Patricia connected me to a support group for seniors dealing with family exploitation. I attended the group nervously, expecting shame. Instead, I found reflection. A man named Robert said, My son called me selfish for not signing over my bank account. I believed him for months. A woman named Dorothy whispered, Mine said no one would visit me in a nursing home if I didn't agree. Their stories echoed mine, not exactly, but painfully close. I realized Brian and Tiffany weren't unique. They were part of a pattern older people rarely talked about. When I returned home that night, stronger and steadier, I found another email from Tiffany. Short, sharp, cold. Your silence speaks volumes, Margaret. We tried. You chose that lawyer over your family. When you're alone and need help, don't come to us. I read it without a flicker of emotion. Then I forwarded it to Sarah and pressed delete. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. 3 quiet weeks passed quiet in the way a storm can be quiet before it breaks. I spent my mornings tending to the hydrangeas, evenings reading in the sunroom, and the rest of my time gathering strength like a fortress rebuilding its walls. But I wasn't naive. Brian and Tiffany hadn't disappeared. They were waiting, plotting, choosing their moment. It arrived on a Sunday morning, crisp and golden. I was pruning a cluster of fading blossoms when I heard 2 car doors slam, one familiar, one not. I straightened slowly, the gardening shears still in my hand. Brian's silver sedan. Right behind it, a dark sedan I didn't recognize. They walked toward me in a formation that looked rehearsed. Brian wearing an expression of strained patience, Tiffany with overly soft eyes, and between them, an older woman dressed in a charcoal coat and carrying a leather portfolio. "Mom," Brian called out. "We need to talk." I didn't invite them inside. Let them say whatever they came to say right here, among my roses. The woman stepped forward, extending her hand. "Mrs. Sanderson, I'm Dr. Patricia Henshaw. I'm a geriatric care specialist. Your son asked me to assess your living situation." Of course, a doctor. They brought a doctor to label me incompetent. I wiped soil from my hands and met her polite smile with a steady one of my own. "I didn't request an assessment," I said. "Of course not," the doctor replied smoothly. "Many seniors don't realize when assistance is needed. The signs can be subtle missed bills, difficulty maintaining the home, isolation." "I pay all my bills on time," I interrupted. "I maintain my home. And I'm not isolated. I'm surrounded by people who actually care about me." Brian's jaw tensed. "Mom, please don't make this harder than it has to be." Tiffany stepped in next, her tone dripping with practiced empathy. "We just want to help you, Margaret. We've been so worried." "And," she hesitated, placing a hand on her chest, "we've actually canceled our Maldives trip. Family comes first." The lie was so bold, it almost amused me. "Show me the cancellation email," I said. Brian blinked. Tiffany stiffened. "What?" he snapped. "If you canceled it, show me the confirmation. The refund notice. Anything." His face reddened in a way I'd only seen when he was caught lying as a child. "I can't believe you still don't trust us," he said, voice rising. "After everything we've tried to do for you." "You tried to sell my house," I said calmly. "You hired movers behind my back. You lied repeatedly. Why exactly should I trust you?" The doctor cleared her throat, stepping back into the performance. "Mrs. Sanderson, this level of suspicion, believing loved ones are plotting against you, is actually common in the early stages of cognitive decline. Paranoia, mistrust, defensiveness." I cut her off. "Doctor, what I'm experiencing isn't paranoia. It's evidence." I pulled out my phone. "Would you like to see it? The moving company's work order? The credit card statements? Their paid vacation package?" "Because I have all of it." For the first time, the doctor's practiced expression cracked, just slightly, but I saw it. Tiffany's mask broke entirely. "You've turned her against us?" she snapped at Sarah, even though Sarah wasn't there. "With your accusations and your paranoia and your lawyer tricks?" Brian added sharply. "We were trying to build a relationship here, Mom. Trying to help. And you treat us like criminals." "You committed a crime," I replied. That landed like a stone. Brian stepped closer, eyes blazing. "We made a mistake." "A mistake, Mom. People make mistakes. But instead of forgiving us, instead of being a real mother, you act like you're some victim." I stared at him for a long moment. "My son," I said quietly, "a real mistake can be fixed. What you did wasn't a mistake. It was a plan." His face twisted. "You're going to regret this. We'll prove you're incompetent. We'll get guardianship. You can't stop us." That was when the garden's silence broke. "Actually," I said, "I can." I lifted my phone, showing the small blinking red dot in the top corner. "I have security cameras. They've recorded this entire conversation." Tiffany paled. The doctor looked genuinely alarmed. Brian's anger faltered into something closer to fear. "I think we're done here," I said. "Let's go," the doctor muttered quickly, clearly uncomfortable with how deeply she'd stepped into something unethical. Brian pointed a shaking finger at me as they retreated. "You'll regret this, Mom. You're choosing strangers over your own family." "No," I said. "I'm choosing myself." They left in silence, tires crunching over the gravel with a bitterness that hung in the air long after they were gone. The moment the cars disappeared down the street, I called Sarah. "They brought a doctor," I told her. "They tried to declare me incompetent right in my garden." Sarah didn't gasp. She didn't even sound surprised. "They're escalating," she said, "which means everything we're doing is working. But they're desperate now. And desperate people take dangerous steps." "What do I do?" I asked. "You keep documenting. You don't meet them alone. You don't let them inside. And Margaret, prepare yourself." "For what?" "For legal action. The next move will be guardianship." And she was right. A few weeks later, a thick envelope arrived in my mailbox. A petition for emergency guardianship, filed by my son, claiming I was mentally unfit, claiming I could not care for myself, claiming he needed control of my finances for my well-being. I held the papers in my hands and felt no fear, only clarity. If this was the battle he wanted, then this time I would not be the one caught off guard. The guardianship hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, but Sarah and I began preparing days earlier, treating it like a battle we fully intended to win. She arrived with binders, actual binders, full of neatly labeled documents, financial records, medical evaluations, screenshots, statements, timestamps, proof stacked so high it felt like armor. The night before the hearing, she sat across from me at my kitchen table. "Margaret," she said gently, "tomorrow will hurt. Brian will lie. Tiffany will cry. The doctor will twist your words. They will tell a story where you're the villain and they're the heroes. Be ready." "I am," I told her, and I meant it. But the truth was, I didn't sleep that night, not because I feared losing, because I feared seeing how far my son had fallen. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, almost shabby compared to the weight of what would be decided inside it. Brian sat at the petitioner's table beside his attorney, James Kirkland. Tiffany was behind them in a modest beige dress, far too muted for her usual style. She had dressed for pity. They didn't look at me when I walked in. Good. Judge Patricia Carmichael took her seat, a woman whose posture alone demanded honesty. "Mr. Kirkland," she began, "you filed for emergency guardianship over Mrs. Sanderson. Present your case." Brian's attorney stood first, smoothing his tie. "Your Honor, my client is deeply concerned about his mother's deteriorating mental state. She lives alone in a large, unsafe property she can no longer maintain. She has become paranoid, hostile, and financially irresponsible." I almost laughed. Me financially irresponsible? But Sarah squeezed my hand. A silent reminder. "Let them talk. Let them reveal themselves." Kirkland continued. "We have a medical professional present to testify to behavioral changes consistent with cognitive decline. Of course, Dr. Henshaw." She took the stand next, and she lied, softly, smoothly, with the gentle tone of someone explaining a delicate truth. She was suspicious, defensive, accused her son of stealing from her with no evidence, exhibited signs of isolation and confusion. Confusion? The only thing I was confused about was why a licensed doctor was willing to ruin her credibility for two people who couldn't even manage their own credit cards. Next came the character witnesses. A colleague of Brian's testified about what a devoted son he was. Tiffany's sister claimed I'd been odd and withdrawn lately. Someone else said I'd become forgetful, a carefully built illusion brick by brick. And finally, Brian himself took the stand. "Brian," his attorney said softly, "tell the court about your mother." And my son, my child, put on the performance of his life. He spoke in a trembling voice, describing me as a lonely, fragile woman refusing help out of pride. "She won't answer my calls. She barely leaves the house. She's become paranoid and believes I'm trying to hurt her. I love my mom. I'm just trying to keep her safe." Then the tears came. Real tears? Fake? I couldn't tell anymore. But what I did know was that my son cried more in that courtroom than he had at Tom's funeral. Kirkland lowered his voice dramatically. "And the incident with the movers?" Brian swallowed hard. "I shouldn't have arranged them without telling her. I was scared for her. I made a mistake. But I only did it because I thought it would help her. I wasn't thinking straight. We had so much going on." He avoided mentioning the Maldives entirely. Sarah's turn came like the snap of a winter wind. She approached the stand with a precision that made Brian shift uncomfortably. "Mr. Sanderson," she began, "you testified that your actions came from concern. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And yet you hired movers without your mother's permission. It was a mistake." "Yes," Sarah said, "a mistake that coincided with a $47,000 payment to a luxury resort in the Maldives." The courtroom went silent. Brian's eyes widened. Tiffany stiffened in her seat. Kirkland turned a shade paler. Sarah pulled out printed screenshots, photos Tiffany had posted, countdowns, resort confirmations. "Your Honor, this trip was neither canceled nor postponed due to concern for Mrs. Sanderson. In fact, updated itineraries were posted online just 2 weeks ago. She wasn't done." Next came the financial records. The 6-figure loan, the credit card debt, the missed payments. "Mr. Sanderson is drowning financially," Sarah said, "and attempted to use his mother's home placed in a trust he has no control over to rescue himself." Finally, it was my turn. I took the stand and answered everything with clarity. My routine, my finances, my volunteer work, my book club, my support system, my medical evaluations confirming excellent cognitive health. Sarah asked one last question. "Mrs. Sanderson, why do you believe your son filed for guardianship?" I looked directly at Brian. "Because I refused to let him steal my home. Because I refused to fund his vacation. Because he needed my assets more than he needed my well-being." Judge Carmichael called for a recess. 20 minutes later, she returned with her ruling. "Having reviewed all evidence," she said, her voice cutting cleanly through the room, "I find no grounds for emergency guardianship. Mrs. Sanderson is competent, independent, and financially stable. This petition appears to be an attempt to gain access to her assets under false pretenses." Brian's face collapsed. Tiffany burst into tears, angry tears, not sorrowful ones. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "Mr. Sanderson is ordered to pay all of his mother's legal fees, and I am referring this case to Adult Protective Services for investigation into possible financial exploitation." The gavel struck. The war was over, and I had won. The aftermath came quickly. APS investigators contacted me. I handed them everything: emails, recordings, screenshots, statements, timelines. They handled the rest. Brian's employer opened their own review. A financial consultant attempting to defraud his own mother? They couldn't overlook that. He was fired. For cause. No severance. No references. No future in finance. Tiffany's real estate license came under scrutiny. Her brokerage dropped her quietly, unwilling to be tied to elder fraud whispers. Their Maldives trip? Cancelled with no refund. Their mortgage? 2 months overdue. Foreclosure proceedings began. Their perfect life cracked from every angle, like a glass bowl struck too hard. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, all I felt was a strange, aching sadness for the boy he used to be. But sadness wasn't regret, and it certainly wasn't forgiveness. In the quiet months that followed the courtroom battle, my life settled into a rhythm so peaceful, it almost felt unreal. No surprise visits, no guilt-laced phone calls, no threats disguised as concern. For the first time in a long time, my house felt like mine again. Not a battleground, not a prize someone was trying to pry from my hands, just home. And with peace came space. Space to rebuild, to reclaim, and to grow. I began with the kitchen. New cabinets, new countertops, a stove that didn't hiss at me every time I turned it on. I spent money I had earned, saved, and protected over a lifetime. No guilt, no second guessing. Tom would have loved the new layout: open, bright, filled with soft morning light. Next came the bathrooms. Then a sunroom addition, a quiet place with wide windows and a cozy chair where I could drink coffee and watch the garden bloom. I wasn't just updating a house. I was building the next chapter of my life with my own 2 hands. My book club became a second family. We doubled our meetings, alternating between my house and others. On the nights I hosted, the dining room filled with laughter and arguments about plot twists and character flaws, with warm casseroles and half-finished glasses of wine left on the table. And then something unexpected happened. I became useful, truly useful. The library asked if I could help teach digital literacy to seniors, email scams, password safety, avoiding predatory loans. Within a month, my class was full. By month 2, I had a waiting list. Someone asked me once, "Why do you volunteer so much now?" I didn't know how to explain that teaching others to protect themselves made me feel like I was redeeming something, like I was planting seeds that would prevent someone else's Brian from winning. Eventually, the senior support group I joined asked if I would speak at their annual fundraiser. Me, a woman who used to tremble through PTA meetings. But I said yes. Standing at that podium, looking out at rows of people who had been bruised by the people they loved most, I spoke my truth. Love does not mean giving someone the right to rob you. And age does not mean surrender. When the applause came 3 full minutes, I felt something inside me heal. Updates about Brian and Tiffany trickled in occasionally, like news carried on a reluctant breeze. They lost the townhouse to foreclosure, moved into a cramped rental across town. Tiffany lost her brokerage job and was working as a receptionist. Brian, once a financial consultant, was now selling basic insurance policies no firm would touch him after the APS report. Their social circle shrank. Tiffany's glamorous Instagram life evaporated, replaced with vague motivational quotes and carefully cropped photos that hid their reality. One acquaintance told me they'd filed for bankruptcy after months of juggling overdue bills. Another mentioned seeing them in a grocery store, arguing over which generic cereal was cheapest. Their marriage was straining under the weight of their own choices. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel pity. I felt distance, like watching characters in a story I no longer belonged to. Then, one afternoon, a letter appeared in my mailbox, hand-delivered, no stamp, Brian's handwriting. I hesitated before opening it. Mom, we lost everything. The house, our jobs, our friends. We can barely pay rent. Tiffany's parents won't speak to us. I know you think I deserve this. Maybe I do. I never meant to hurt you. I was drowning. I made terrible decisions. I'm not asking you for money. I'm not asking for anything. I just want you to know I'm sorry. Brian. I read it twice. Then I placed it in the folder with every other piece of documentation because sorrow does not erase facts. When Sarah called that evening, she had news. Brian's attorney reached out, she said. They want a settlement. What kind of settlement? They want to avoid any further legal actions. If you agree not to sue for damages or emotional distress, Brian will sign away any future claim to your estate and agree not to contest your will. I thought about it for just a moment. Good, I said. But add one more condition. Brian must complete a financial counseling program and show proof of it. Sarah actually laughed. You're generous. No, I said. I'm practical. 2 weeks later, all papers were finalized. Brian and Tiffany forfeited any future claim to my assets. All guardianship options were permanently closed. Everything was finally legally mine. And that night, I updated my will. My house, the one Brian tried so hard to steal, would go to charity, the Senior Financial Protection Foundation. My savings would help fund legal aid for older adults facing the same nightmare I had. Brian would receive nothing, not out of revenge, out of clarity. People show you who they are, and when they do, you believe them. 1 year after the attempted fraud, I hosted a garden party under string lights that glowed like fireflies. Dozens of people came: book club friends, library volunteers, neighbors, support group families, even Sarah with her husband and daughter. My yard buzzed with life, laughter, music, clinking glasses. The hydrangeas had bloomed beautifully that year, as if celebrating with me. Someone asked, Margaret, do you ever regret how things turned out with Brian? I looked around at the people who stood by me, at the home I fought to protect, at the life I'd rebuilt piece by piece. I smiled. Not for a second. Because sometimes choosing yourself isn't selfish. Sometimes it's survival. And sometimes, just sometimes, it becomes your superpower. So that is my story. My son tried to steal my home. I fought back. And I won my freedom not just from him, but from fear, guilt, and silence. If my story touched you, share yours. Tell someone who needs to hear it. And remember, you are never too old to fight for what's yours.